The email arrived at 7:03 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was just about to close my laptop, the soft click of the magnetic latch, a nightly ritual that signaled the end of another day spent wrestling with the beautiful, chaotic beast that was Maison Veronne's supply chain. But a notification bloomed in the corner of my screen, a stark white rectangle against the dark wallpaper of my desktop. The subject line was chillingly neutral: organizational update. It was from Reed. My name is Adelaide, and for 15 years I was the senior logistics manager for Veronne. To most people, even to most people inside that gleaming glass tower of a headquarters, my job sounded about as glamorous as institutional carpeting: logistics. It's a word that conjures images of cardboard boxes, shipping containers, and men in high-visibility vests yelling over the roar of a forklift. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't right either. Not even close. Before I tell you what happened next, what that email contained, and the chain reaction it set off, just do me a favor. If you've ever poured your soul into a job only to be made to feel like a ghost in the machine, like a line item on a budget that could be easily erased, hit that like button. It's a small thing, I know, but it helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void here. I clicked the email. The text was short, brutal in its efficiency. It was a masterclass in corporate speak, designed to communicate a message of profound personal disruption without accepting a shred of human responsibility. Words like streamlining, synergies, and strategic realignment floated in the sterile prose. The final sentence was the only one that mattered. As part of this effort, the position of senior logistics manager has been identified as redundant, effective immediately. Redundant, a word that means superfluous, unnecessary, a word that turns a person into a thing. 15 years of my life, my family's legacy, reduced to a synonym for waste. There was a link to an HR portal for my exit package. There was a note that my system access would be revoked within the hour. There was no thank you, no phone call, no meeting. Just an email, sent 3 minutes after the official close of business, a digital execution. My boss, Reed, the newly minted chief operating officer, was a man who collected MBA jargon like a child collects baseball cards. He saw the world through the lens of a spreadsheet. To him, I was an anomaly, a holdover from a bygone era. He thought I was a paper pusher, a glorified clerk who managed shipping manifests and argued with customs brokers. He thought my salary was a line item that could be zeroed out and replaced with some off-the-shelf logistics software. He honestly believed my entire function could be automated, absorbed by a junior buyer with a subscription to a shipping aggregator. What Reed didn't know, what the glossy corporate handbooks and the pristine organizational charts never showed, was that my real job had nothing to do with paper. My real job was managing secrets. My real job was tending to a garden of delicate, off-the-books relationships with a handful of old-world European artisans. These were the families, the Bellinis in Florence, the Dubois in Lyon, the Ortegas in Andalusia, who created the components for our most exclusive, most iconic, and most profitable handbags. The hand-tooled leather, the specially woven silk linings, the bespoke brass clasps. These things were the soul of Maison Veronne. They were also a complete mystery to Maison Veronne. These families had no formal contracts. They didn't have websites or corporate email addresses. They had worked with my family, with my father before me and his father before him, for generations, and they only ever dealt with me. Reed thought he was just trimming fat. He had no idea he was cutting out the company's heart. He fired me on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, when he tried to place a new order for the upcoming fall collection, they refused. All of them. And that's when my new life began. I've since started my own sourcing consultancy. My old company, the one that called me redundant, is now my biggest client, and they are forced to hire me, at 5 times my old salary, to act as the middleman for the very artisans they never even knew existed. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about value, and what happens when a company forgets where it comes from. The drive home from the office that night, or rather the drive home from the coffee shop across the street where I sat staring at that email for an hour, is a blur. I remember the streetlights smearing across the windshield, fat, greasy tears of orange and white. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white mountains on a pale, shaking landscape. The calm, professional mask I had worn for 15 years, the one I put on every morning with my sensible heels and my tailored blazer, had shattered. It wasn't on the floor in pieces, it had evaporated, turning into a hot, prickling pressure behind my eyes. I made it to my apartment building, parked the car in my designated spot, and walked through the lobby with the practiced gait of someone who was fine, just tired after a long day. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, the gentle hum of the motor, a mocking counterpoint to the screaming in my head. I closed the apartment door behind me, and the deadbolt sliding into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a seal being broken, a container being breached, and then I fell apart. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet, hideous implosion. I slid down the back of the door until I was sitting on the cool hardwood floor of the entryway, my bag slumping beside me. The tears finally came, hot and silent, tracking clean paths through the foundation I had forgotten to wash off. It wasn't just about the job. It wasn't just about the money, though God knows that was a terrifying new reality to face. It was the sheer, insulting erasure of it all. 15 years. Wiped clean by a man who had been at the company for less than 15 months. A man who wore his ambition like a cheap suit, shiny and ill-fitting. Reed. He probably went home and told his wife he'd had a productive day, that he'd made a tough but necessary call for the health of the business. He probably slept like a baby. I sat there on the floor, in the dark, and felt the weight of my own history pressing down on me. This job wasn't just a career, it was a covenant. My father, Robert, had been Verone's head of production for 30 years. He wasn't a corporate man. He was a craftsman who happened to work in a corporation. He smelled of leather oil and French cigarettes, not boardrooms and stale coffee. He never talked to me about climbing the ladder or managing up. He talked about grain, about tension, about the way a properly stitched seam felt beneath your thumb. When I was a little girl, summer vacations weren't trips to Disneyland, they were pilgrimages. We'd fly to Florence, and my father wouldn't take me to the Uffizi Gallery first. He'd take me to a dusty, sun-drenched workshop in the Oltrarno district, down a narrow alley that smelled of baking bread and turpentine. This was the Bellini workshop. I remember Enzo Bellini, a man who looked as old and tough as the olive trees in the courtyard, lifting me up to see the vast sheets of leather hanging from the rafters. He'd let me touch the tools, their wooden handles worn smooth by 3 generations of his family's hands. He didn't speak much English, and I spoke no Italian, but we communicated in the universal language of making things. He'd hand me a scrap of leather, and my father would show me how to mark it, how to feel the difference between the flank and the shoulder. This wasn't a factory. It was a home. Enzo's wife, Sophia, would bring us small glasses of lemonade, her smile a beautiful roadmap of wrinkles. Then we'd go to Lyon, to a tall, narrow house on the Croix-Rousse hill. This was where the Dubois family lived and worked. For 200 years, they had woven silk for everyone from Napoleonic royalty to Verone. I remember Madame Dubois, Hélène, sitting at a massive jacquard loom that took up an entire room, its wooden frame groaning and clicking like a living creature. She showed me how the punch cards, a system that felt ancient and futuristic at the same time, translated patterns into impossibly intricate silk linings for our handbags. She let me touch the threads, finer than a spider's web but stronger than steel. Her husband, Pierre, would be in the back, mixing dyes in huge copper vats, his arms stained with brilliant jewel tones. And finally, we would go to a small white village in the hills of Andalusia, where the Ortega family forged our signature brass clasps. They worked out of a small stone building that used to be an olive press. I remember the smell of hot metal, and the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of a hammer on an anvil. Iago Ortega, the patriarch, would show me the molds his grandfather had carved from soapstone, patterns that existed nowhere else on earth. These weren't suppliers, they were family friends, they were the secret ingredients. My father understood this. He knew that the magic of a Verone bag wasn't in the logo they stamped on it at the end. It was in the life that was breathed into it by these hands, in these hidden corners of the world. And he knew the corporation, with its endless hunger for growth and efficiency, would eventually try to devour that magic. So he built a fortress around it. He created something called the Artisan Fund. On the company's books, it was a single boring line item under the production budget. Legacy sourcing and development. It was a discretionary fund, approved decades ago, that I took over when he retired. All payments to the families came from this fund. I handled the international transfers myself, through a private banking channel my father had set up. The invoices were vague, listing artisan services or material commissions. There were no names, no addresses. To an outsider like Reed, it just looked like a bloated, unitemized expense account. An antique, a relic, the perfect thing to streamline. I remember trying to explain it to him once. Early in his tenure, I was in his office, a sterile white box that looked like an Apple store. He was staring at a chart on his oversized monitor. I said, "Reed, I'd like to walk you through the sourcing for the Florentina line. It's a bit different from our other supply chains." He didn't even look at me. He just waved a dismissive hand. "Adelaide," he'd said, his eyes still glued to the screen, "we're not running a museum here. We need scalable partners, not pen pals. We need to be thinking about volume, about second and third sourcing options in lower-cost regions. That's where the growth is." He didn't want to understand. He just wanted to conquer. Sitting there on my cold floor, the memory of his dismissiveness was a fresh splash of gasoline on the fire of my humiliation. My phone, lying face down on the rug, buzzed, then it buzzed again. I ignored it. It was probably my mother, wondering why I wasn't answering, or my sister. I couldn't talk to them yet. I couldn't give voice to the failure. But it buzzed a third time, a more insistent, rapid vibration, a text message. With a deep sigh, I reached for it, my thumb smearing the screen. It was from Clara. Clara was my assistant, a bright, fiercely intelligent young woman I had hired 2 years ago straight out of university. I saw a younger version of myself in her. Not the legacy part, but the quiet competence, the attention to detail, the understanding that the important things often happen in the margins. I had been mentoring her, teaching her the real business, the one that wasn't on the org chart. I'd even begun the slow process of introducing her, via email, to the younger generation of the artisan families. The message was short. "They are going crazy. Reed is trying to find the contact info for the Florentina leather supplier. He's yelling at IT because there's nothing in your archived files, or the central server. He's losing his mind." A small dark seed of something that wasn't despair began to sprout in the pit of my stomach. My fingers were still hovering over the screen when a new email notification popped up. It was from my personal account, not my now defunct work one. The sender's name made my heart stop. Matteo Bellini. Matteo was Enzo's grandson, the heir to the Bellini leather dynasty. He was in his late 20s, sharp, ambitious, and torn between the deep, ingrained traditions of his grandfather and the pull of the modern world. He wanted an Instagram account for their work. Enzo still thought fax machines were a bit flashy. I had become the bridge between them, a translator of generations. The email was brief, written in slightly stilted but clear English. "Adelaide, we hope this email finds you well. A strange thing has happened. A man named Reed, from Verone, contacted us. He found our workshop listed on a local Florentine tourism website and sent a message through their generic contact form. He is asking for a quote for a large order. Enzo is very concerned. He says this is not the way things are done. Is everything all right?" I read the email 3 times. A man named Reed from Verone contacted them through a tourism website. A tourism website. He was a rampaging bull in a garden he didn't even know was fragile, and that was it. That was the spark. The self-pity, the grief, the humiliation, it all burned away in an instant, leaving behind something hard and cold and perfectly clear, a single, crystalline thought. He didn't cut me out. He cut himself off. He hadn't just fired an employee. He had severed the company's main artery, and he was so arrogant, so completely ignorant, that he didn't even know he was bleeding out. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights, a glittering web of possibilities. The tears were gone. My hands were steady. This was no longer a breakdown. It was a beginning. It was never about getting revenge. It was about correcting a mistake. A very, very expensive mistake. My father was a man of quiet paranoias. He trusted people, implicitly, but he never trusted systems. He used to say, "Adelaide, a company is not your family. It's a vessel, and vessels can leak, or they can sink, or they can decide to throw their most valuable cargo overboard to lighten the load. You have to build your own lifeboat, just in case." For years I thought he was just being a bit dramatic, a bit old-world pessimistic, but I listened, and I built. I was never naive about my position at Verone. I saw the way the corporate winds shifted, the way new executives like Reed came in with their buzzsaws and their rhetoric, looking for old growth to clear cut. So, I maintained the fortress my father had built, and I reinforced its walls. My real work, the management of the artisan network, existed in a completely parallel universe to my corporate job. At my desk at Verone, I had the company-issued laptop, the one where I managed the mundane, official logistics, the shipping of finished goods from our mainstream factories, the tracking of fabric from our commercial suppliers. But at home, I had what I called the Black Book. It wasn't a physical book, of course. That would be far too romantic and far too risky. It was a small, unassuming external hard drive, triple encrypted, that lived in a fireproof safe in my closet, and on that drive was my real work. It was a database I had built myself, a testament to 15 years of relationships. It held the real contact information for the families, their private phone numbers, their personal email addresses, the WhatsApp numbers for their children. It held the real ledgers, detailing every order, every payment, every custom request for the last 2 decades. It contained the unique convoluted shipping routes we used, routes that bypassed the massive impersonal commercial freight hubs, and instead used a network of specialized art handlers and private couriers who knew how to move priceless, delicate things across borders with the care they deserved. But it was more than that. It contained the human data. It noted that Enzo Bellini's birthday was in April and that he loved a particular vintage of Chianti. It reminded me that Hélène Dubois' eldest daughter was studying architecture in Paris and was always stressed about her exams. It had a note that Iago Ortega's wife collected antique porcelain, and that I should always ask about her latest find. It was a map of trust, a blueprint of relationships. It was the single most valuable asset connected to Maison Verone's high-end accessories division, and it didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. The night I was fired, after reading Matteo's email, the first thing I did wasn't to cry or rage. I walked to my closet, opened the safe, and held that small, cool metal rectangle in my hand. Then I sat down at my personal computer, logged into Verone's system, using a back-end remote access I had maintained for emergency IT purposes, and performed a deep forensic wipe of my user profile. Any stray crumbs of information, any residual contact data, any hint of the real way things worked, gone. It was a digital ghosting, and then there was the matter of customs. This was my little masterpiece of plausible inaccuracy, a bureaucratic tripwire I had set years ago. When you import luxury goods, the paperwork is everything. Reed and his new team would assume our handbags were just that, handbags. They would classify them under a standard tariff code for fashion accessories. They would fill out the forms, pay the standard VAT and import duties, and expect a smooth process. They would be wrong. The handbags made by the families were special. The quantities were small, the craftsmanship unique. I had worked for years with a specialized customs broker to classify them not as manufactured goods, but as bespoke commissioned artworks. It was a subtle distinction, but a critical one. It placed them under a completely different, much more obscure, EU tariff schedule. The duties were significantly lower, but it came with a catch. Each shipment had to be accompanied by a signed and certified artisan provenance document, a formal declaration from the creator, attesting to the unique, non-mass-produced nature of the item. Who could procure that document? Only me. I knew that without it, the first shipment Reed's team tried to import would be flagged. It would be impounded by customs, buried under a mountain of paperwork, and slapped with astronomical fines for misdeclaration. It was a beautiful, elegant trap, and they were walking right into it. My first call was to Clara. She picked up on the first ring, her voice a hushed whisper. "Adelaide, are you okay?" I felt a surge of warmth for her. Loyalty like that is a rare and precious thing. "I'm fine, Clara. More than fine. I didn't ask her to do anything illegal. I would never put her in that position. I didn't ask her to steal files or forward emails. I just asked her to be my eyes and ears. Just observe," I said. "Take notes, pay attention to the meetings. Who is in charge of sourcing now? What are they saying? What is the mood?" I told her to be careful, to protect herself first and foremost. Her response was fierce. "They treated you like garbage, Adelaide. After everything you did. Don't worry about me. They won't suspect a thing. They think I'm just a kid who schedules meetings." She was right. They would underestimate her, just as they had underestimated me. My next step was to talk to the families. I didn't want to send a mass email. This had to be done with the same personal touch that defined our entire relationship. I scheduled a series of video calls, starting with the Bellinis. I set up the call for the next morning. When their faces appeared on my screen, Enzo looking grim and Matteo looking anxious, I explained the situation calmly and factually. I told them my position at Verone had been eliminated as part of a restructuring. I didn't badmouth Reed or the company. I simply stated that the new management had a different philosophy, one that focused on scalable, mass-market partners. "My connection to Verone is over," I said simply. "But my connection to you, to your family, is not. That is personal. That is my father's legacy, and my own." Enzo slammed his hand on the table, a booming sound that made the camera shake. He launched into a tirade in passionate Italian. Matteo translated, a wry smile on his face. "Grandfather says they are fools. He says they are boys playing with their father's watches. He says a Verone bag without Bellini leather is just an expensive purse." Matteo then leaned closer to the camera, his expression shifting from amusement to sharp-eyed calculation. "So, Adelaide," he said, his English perfect, "what happens now? They have the brand name, but you have the hands that make the brand." That was it. That was the question that hung in the air, the fulcrum on which everything was about to pivot. I laid out my idea. I told them I was starting my own consultancy, a sourcing agency that would represent a small, curated group of Europe's finest artisans. I wouldn't just be a middleman. I would be their agent, their business manager, their brand ambassador to the world of high fashion. I would negotiate their contracts, manage their orders, and ensure they were paid what they were truly worth, not what a corporate giant thought they could get away with. I would help them with succession planning, ensuring their craft survived for another generation. I looked directly at Matteo when I said that. "We can even," I added with a small smile, "develop a tasteful and strategic social media presence." Matteo's eyes lit up. He saw the future. Enzo, after another translation from his grandson, simply nodded, a slow, grave gesture of assent. My loyalty was to your father, Adelaide, he said, his voice raspy. Now, it is to you. The name on the building does not matter. The name of the person who honors the work is what matters. I had similar conversations with the Dubois and the Ortega families. The reaction was the same: shock, followed by anger on my behalf, followed by unwavering, unconditional loyalty. They had seen this coming for years. They had trusted my father to protect them from the men in suits, and then they had trusted me. My firing wasn't an insult to me alone. It was a betrayal of a promise that spanned generations. It was then that I reflected on my father's secrecy, on my own continuation of it. For years, I told myself I was just being a good steward, protecting the artisans from the corrosive effects of corporate optimization. I believed it was about them. But sitting there, looking at the contracts I was drafting for my new company, I had to ask myself the hard question: was it loyalty, or was it power? Had I, on some subconscious level, been cultivating this secret garden for myself all along? Was this a lifeboat I had built, or was it a quiet coup I had been planning for years? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I tell myself, and I believe it, that it was never about revenge. It was about building a firewall to protect good people. But there's no denying the quiet, satisfying hum of a well-oiled machine clicking into place. A machine of my own design. The next day, I officially registered my company. Lutz Sourcing, simple, professional, anonymous. I bought a domain name, put up a minimalist, elegant website with a simple contact form and a generic email address. Then, I sent formal representation agreements to the 3 families. They were signed and returned within hours. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the animal to walk into it. The first move was silent. It was an exchange of emails, invisible to the wider world but seismic in their impact. On my advice, the Bellini, Dubois, and Ortega families each sent a short, polite, and nearly identical email to the general procurement address at Maison Veronne. It was a masterpiece of professional detachment. To whom it may concern, it began. Please be advised that as of this date, we will no longer be accepting direct commissions for new work. For all future inquiries regarding our services, please direct your correspondence to our exclusive global sourcing agent, Alabama Sourcing. Their contact information is as follows. It listed my new generic info at allsourcing.co email address. They didn't mention my name, they didn't express regret, they simply closed a door that had been open for the better part of a century and pointed to a new one for which only I held the key. The fallout was immediate and spectacular, and I had a front row seat thanks to Clara. Her texts came in a flurry, a real-time narration of the chaos erupting inside Veronne's pristine corporate headquarters. The first text was just a string of shocked face emojis. The next one was more descriptive. Reed just stormed through the department. He was holding his phone like it had personally offended him. He's in the glass conference room with legal. He's shouting about collusions and disloyal vendors. According to Clara, Reed was completely blindsided. He didn't connect Ella Sourcing with me. How could he? In his mind, I was a defunct employee, a piece of obsolete hardware he had smartly decommissioned. He saw this new entity as an aggressive competitor, a corporate raider that had somehow, impossibly, poached his most critical suppliers overnight. His ego couldn't process any other explanation. It was an attack from an outside enemy, not a consequence of his own catastrophic blunder. His first reaction was to try and bully his way through it. He had Veronne's legal team draft threatening letters, full of intimidating language about tortious interference and pre-existing business relationships. The letters were, of course, completely useless. As I knew better than anyone, there were no pre-existing contracts to interfere with. The relationships were based on handshakes and history, things that don't hold up in a courtroom but are far more binding than any legal document. The families, on my advice, simply had AL Sourcing's newly retained lawyer send back a polite one-sentence reply: "We have no record of any formal agreements between our clients and your company. Checkmate." His next move was to try and replace them. Clara described a series of disastrous meetings where Reed's new, flustered procurement team presented alternative suppliers. They had found a large-scale leather tannery in Turkey. They had found a massive silk factory in China. They had found a metal hardware manufacturer in India that could produce thousands of clasps a day. Samples were overnighted. Clara sent me a picture of one of the new leather samples next to a scrap of Bellini leather she had kept on her desk. It was a joke. The Turkish leather was stiff, uniform, and smelled of chemicals. It had no life, no character. The Bellini leather was supple, rich with natural imperfections, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and wine. It was the difference between a photograph of a meal and the meal itself. Reed, apparently, couldn't see the difference. "Leather is leather," he had reportedly yelled. "Just get me something that looks the part." But the design team, the people who actually understood the product, were in quiet rebellion. The quality was an insult to the Verone name. More importantly, the bags made from these new materials would be obvious, cheap-looking forgeries of their own iconic products. The pressure was mounting. The entire fall marketing campaign was built around a new, limited edition version of the Florentina bag, a product that relied on the craftsmanship of all three families. They had already shown previews to fashion editors. They had taken pre-orders from their most important global clients, the kind of women who spend more on handbags in a year than most people make in a decade. Without the real bags, Verone wasn't just facing lost revenue, they were facing a public relations apocalypse. They would have to cancel the launch, admit failure, and explain to their most valuable customers why they couldn't deliver. Reed's final desperate gambit was to try and find the artisans himself. He sent a junior buyer, a kid fresh out of college, on a frantic trip to Europe. Clara told me it was a comedy of errors. The buyer landed in Florence with a vague idea of finding the Bellini workshop. He wandered the Oltrarno district, showing pictures of the Florentina bag to shopkeepers. The locals, fiercely protective of their own, sent him on a series of wild goose chases, to a shoe repair shop, a bookbinder, and at one point, a family that made tourist-grade ceramic cats. He came back a week later, defeated, sunburned and empty-handed. Reed was trapped. Every door was closed. Every path was a dead end. And then finally, the email I had been waiting for landed in my inbox. It was from a junior logistics coordinator at Verone, a name I barely recognized. The subject was urgent sourcing inquiry. The message itself was curt, stripped of all pleasantries. "We require a price quote and lead time for the attached list of SKUs for immediate production. Please provide your terms." It was a list of every single component made by the Bellini, Dubois, and Ortega families. The sender hadn't even bothered to sign their name. It was just from Mason Verone Procurement. The arrogance, even in their desperation, was breathtaking. They still thought they were in charge. They still thought they held the power. They had no idea they were a drowning man asking the ocean for a glass of water. I let the email sit in my inbox for 48 hours. 2 full days of silence. I imagined the panic festering in Reed's office, the increasingly frantic meetings, the slow dawning horror that they had no other options. Let them sweat. Let the silence do its work. It's a lesson my father taught me. The most powerful statement in any negotiation is often a pause. On the 3rd day, I replied. The email was sent from Adelaide Lee, founder and CEO, Alabama. Sourcing. I wanted my name on it for the next stage. The tone was polite, professional, and utterly devastating. "Thank you for your inquiry," I wrote. AL Sourcing represents a collective of Europe's finest master artisans, and we would be pleased to discuss a potential partnership. I attached 2 documents. The first was our standard new client onboarding agreement, a dense legal document full of clauses about exclusivity, intellectual property, and payment terms. The second was our 2023 rate card. I had spent days perfecting that rate card with Matteo and the other families. We had done a thorough market analysis, looking at the margins of other ultra-luxury brands. We discovered, unsurprisingly, that Verone had been drastically underpaying them for decades. So we corrected the market. The per-unit cost for every single component was increased by an average of 30%. It was a long overdue raise for the artisans, a reflection of their true worth. But that wasn't the master stroke. The master stroke was in the fee structure for my company. I outlined 2 fees. The first was a standard commission, a percentage of the total order value. The second was the one I knew would make Reed's blood boil. It was a strategic partnership retainer. For AL Sourcing to even consider taking on Verone as a client, to grant them access to our exclusive network, they would be required to pay a non-refundable, 5-figure monthly retainer, paid in advance. I did the math. Between the increased unit costs, my commission and the retainer, Verone's cost for their most profitable product line was about to increase by a factor of 3. And my personal take-home, just from the retainer alone, would be 5 times my old monthly salary. Less than 10 minutes after I hit send, my phone rang. It was an unlisted number from New York. I knew who it was. I took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and answered with my new formal phone voice. EL Sourcing. How may I help you? The voice on the other end was tight with fury. It was Reed. He didn't even introduce himself. I just got your email. This is insane. It's extortion. I let him rant. I pictured him in his office, pacing, his face red, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke, my voice calm and even. I'm sorry, sir. You'll have to be more specific. Our pricing reflects the unparalleled quality of our clients' work and the high demand for their services. Our clients, he sputtered. These are our suppliers. We've been working with them for 50 years. I believe you're mistaken, I said, the words as cool and smooth as glass. According to our records, the artisan families you're referring to have no formal pre-existing contracts with Maison Verone. They did have a long-standing personal relationship with their former liaison, a Miss Adelaide Lee, but that relationship appears to have been terminated by your company. I let that hang in the air for a second. Our terms, I continued, are non-negotiable. We have a growing list of interested partners, and frankly, we are not obligated to take on any new clients at this time. There was a sudden choked silence on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a man's brain stuttering to a halt, as 2 completely separate, contradictory pieces of information violently collided. The sound of a penny not just dropping, but crashing through the floor. After a few seconds of what sounded like strained breathing, he finally managed to get one word out, his voice a strangled whisper. Adelaide, the power in that moment was intoxicating. It was the complete, total, and irreversible inversion of our entire professional relationship. In that single whispered word, I went from being the redundant paper pusher to the sole arbiter of his company's future. I let the silence stretch, savoring it. I wanted him to sit with it, to feel the full weight of his colossal miscalculation. Yes, Reed, I said finally. My voice as pleasant as if I were asking him to pass the salt. It's me. I could practically hear his world tilting on its axis. Now, I continued, pressing my newfound advantage, about those terms. The deadline to secure production capacity with our artisans for the fall season is this Friday at 5 p.m., Central European Time. After that, we'll be opening up that capacity to our waiting list. I do hope you can make a decision by then. I paused, then delivered the killing blow. I'd love to chat more, but I have a call with a team from Hermès in 10 minutes to discuss a potential exclusivity deal. So if you'll excuse me. I didn't have a call with Hermès. but he didn't know that. And in that moment, he believed I held the keys to the entire kingdom. He was no longer the boss. He was a beggar, and he knew it. The capitulation was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The next day, I received a call not from Reed, but from Verone's general counsel. She was all business, her voice clipped and professional, but the undertone of desperation was unmistakable. She tried to negotiate. She called my retainer unprecedented, and the price increase untenable. I listened politely, and then simply reiterated my position. "My terms are my terms," I said. "The clock is ticking." She said she would have to confer with the board. That was the signal that Reed had lost control. He was no longer empowered to make the decision. He had been sidelined. 24 hours later, a signed contract, scanned and attached to a terse email from the lawyer, arrived in my inbox. They had agreed to everything: the price increase, the commission, the outrageous monthly retainer, the first wire transfer, a staggering six-figure sum, covering the retainer, and the initial deposit for the fall order, hit my newly opened business bank account the following morning. I stared at the number on the screen. The feeling wasn't the giddy elation I might have expected. It was a quiet, profound sense of gravity, of a universe that had been knocked off kilter, and was now slowly, painstakingly, righting itself. It was the feeling of balance being restored. A week later, we had the official project kickoff call. It was a mandatory video conference. My screen was a gallery of grim faces. There was the CEO, a man named Jean-Luc, who looked like his smile was physically painful. There was the general counsel, her expression a perfect mask of neutrality. And there was Reed. He looked terrible. He was pale, his eyes were sunken, and he had the haunted look of a man who hadn't slept in a week. He stared at a point just to the left of his camera, unable to make eye contact with me. I, on the other hand, was in my home office, a bright, airy room with a large window. I was wearing a simple silk blouse. I felt calm, centered, and completely in control. Jean-Luc, the CEO, did most of the talking, his words dripping with a forced, syrupy cordiality. He spoke of a new chapter, and a valuable strategic partnership. He never once mentioned my previous employment, or the circumstances of my departure. It was a masterclass in corporate denial. The entire meeting was a surreal piece of theater. They were asking me for timelines, for production updates, for the very information they had paid me, a fraction of my current fee to manage just a few weeks earlier. I provided the information calmly and concisely, as if we were all just normal business partners. At the very end of the call, as we were about to sign off, Jean-Luc turned to Reed. "Reed, you'll coordinate with Adelaide on sending over the formal purchase orders, correct?" Reed, who had been silent the entire meeting, flinched. He finally looked at his camera, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. He nodded, a jerky, puppet-like motion. "Yes, I'll get those over to you." "Adelaide." He said my name like it was a piece of broken glass in his mouth. Before he could say anything else, I held up a hand. "Just one more thing, Reed," I said, my voice soft but carrying an undeniable edge. The others on the call tensed. Reed looked at me, his eyes wide with a sort of primal fear. "I just wanted to take a moment to thank you," I said, letting a small, polite smile touch my lips. "A few weeks ago you told me you were streamlining the business, eliminating redundancies to improve efficiency. And you know what? You were absolutely right. You did. You just streamlined Verone's profits directly into my new company's bank account." The silence that followed was absolute. I saw the CEO's jaw tighten, his eyes flashing with a cold fury that was directed entirely at the man next to him. I saw the lawyer look down at her notes, suddenly fascinated by the paper in front of her. Reed's face went from pale to a ghostly white. He looked like he had been punched in the stomach. "I'll be waiting for those POs," I said brightly, and with a final, pleasant smile, I ended the call. The epilogue was delivered, as always, via text message from Clara. A week after that call, she sent me a screenshot of an internal company-wide announcement. Reed was no longer with the company. The official reason was a carefully worded sentence about him leaving to pursue other opportunities. The unofficial reason, which Clara said spread through the office like wildfire, was that he had been fired by the board for gross mismanagement of key supplier relationships during a critical product transition. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My first official act as CEO of Allsourcing was to hire Clara as my director of operations, at a salary that was nearly double what she was making at Verone. My new life wasn't about the money, though the financial security was a freedom I had never known. It was about respect. It was about control. It was about spending my days not in sterile boardrooms fighting for a budget, but on the phone with Matteo, helping him plan a new apprenticeship program, or with Helene, discussing new dye techniques. We weren't just making handbags anymore. We were building a sustainable future for these families, on their own terms. It was never about revenge. It was about value. It was about reminding a giant faceless corporation that its soul wasn't in its logo, but in the hands of the people it had tried so hard to erase. A few months later, I was in Florence. I was sitting in the courtyard of the Bellini workshop, the late afternoon sun warming the old stones. The air smelled of cypress trees and leather. Enzo, who had been quietly working at his bench, came over and placed a box on the table in front of me. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a Florentina bag. It was the most beautiful one I had ever seen. The leather a rich, deep cognac, the stitching perfect, but it was the inside that made me catch my breath. Where the gold-stamped Mason Verone logo should have been, Enzo had hand-tooled a new insignia. It was a simple, elegant ALS. He tapped it with a gnarled, knowing finger. "This," he said in his thick, raspy voice, "is the true brand Adelaide, the one built on trust." I ran my fingers over the letters, and I finally understood. The brand wasn't the company. It was the connection. My name is Adelaide, and for 15 years, I let a corporation define my worth. They put a price on my time, gave me a title, and decided my value based on a line in their budget. They thought my power was in my job title, in my access to their systems. They never ever understood that real power, true leverage, isn't something that can be given or taken away by a boss. It's in the relationships you build with your own two hands. It's in the trust you earn, day by day, year by year. It's in the quiet, specialized knowledge you cultivate that no one else can replicate or even comprehend. They can take your job. They can take your desk. They can revoke your access and send you a sterile email. But they cannot take who you are. They cannot take what you know. If you are sitting at a desk right now, in any job, in any industry, and you feel invisible, if you feel underestimated, if you feel like your true contributions are being ignored or erased, I want you to remember this story. You are the architect of your own life. You hold the blueprints. The people who look past you, the ones who dismiss you as a paper pusher or a redundancy, they are not a wall, they are a doorway. They are a sign that the structure you're in is no longer worthy of your talents. So don't wait for them to see your worth. Don't waste your energy trying to convince them. Build your own table, build your own house, and when they come knocking, because they will, remember to charge them a retainer. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to prove your own value in a world that tried to discount it, please do me a personal favor and hit that like button. It truly means the world to know these stories connect. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they hold the keys to their own kingdom. And please leave a comment below and tell me about a time you had to build your own table. I promise you, I read every single one, and of course don't forget to subscribe for more stories about turning the tables and reclaiming your power. Thank you for listening.